The morning at JFK Airport was crisp, sunlight spilling over the tarmac, glinting off the silver fuselage of Flight 482, bound for Los Angeles. Inside the terminal, passengers shuffled along, dragging luggage and chatting casually. Among them, a quiet teenage girl moved with deliberate calm, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a paperback book in her hand. She rarely spoke, often overlooked by classmates and even strangers, blending into the background as if she were a shadow. Today, however, that unassuming nature would become her greatest strength. She found her seat near the back of the aircraft, silently observing the cabin as she stowed her bag in the overhead compartment. Families fussed over children, while business travelers tapped away on laptops, earbuds in, oblivious to the world around them. Flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisle, greeting passengers, offering instructions, and checking seat belts. The hum of conversation filled the cabin, a mix of laughter, yawns, and low murmurs. It was an ordinary flight, routine, unremarkable at least. It seemed that way. Outside the window, the morning sun glimmered off the wing. The plane's engines roared to life, and the aircraft began its taxi down the runway. The girl's eyes followed the wings as they lifted slightly, a subtle fascination evident in her gaze. Unlike other passengers, she wasn't distracted by phones or idle chatter. Her mind cataloged every detail, the aircraft's ascent, the steady hum of the engines, even the slight tremor through the cabin floor as the wheels left the ground. Flight wasn't just travel to her. It was something she had studied, something she understood in a way most people never did. As the plane climbed into the sky, the blue of the horizon deepened, dotted with wispy clouds. Passengers settled into their routines. Some dozed, some scrolled through screens, and others chatted lazily. The girl, headphones resting around her neck now, opened her book but kept glancing at the cockpit doors with quiet curiosity. She wasn't nervous. There was a sense of anticipation in her movements, a careful awareness of her surroundings. She had always been the observer, the one who noticed what others missed. Flight attendants passed down the aisles again, offering drinks and snacks. A mother scolded her young son for kicking the seat in front of him. A businessman muttered as he struggled to fit his briefcase under the seat, and a group of teenagers laughed loudly, completely absorbed in their own world. No one took notice of the quiet girl as she tucked her feet under her seat and leaned slightly back, scanning the cabin with calm, deliberate attention. She noted the seating layout, the locations of emergency exits, and the positions of passengers who might need help in an emergency. Her calm exterior masked the subtle excitement coursing through her veins. She had spent countless hours imagining scenarios just like this: one-engine failures, sudden turbulence, emergency descents. While others had played games or watched movies, she had memorized procedures, studied aircraft systems, and mentally rehearsed what to do in the unthinkable. Today, all that preparation was still just theoretical, yet she sensed instinctively that ordinary calm might soon collide with extraordinary danger. At 30,000 feet, the world below seemed distant and tranquil, the sprawling cityscape shrinking into tiny, unrecognizable patterns. Most passengers were blissfully unaware that the ordinary hum of the plane could be disrupted at any second, that every routine flight carried a hidden potential for chaos. And in the midst of the ordinary, the quiet girl remained poised, a calm observer in a sea of complacency, completely unnoticed yet unknowingly ready. No one on the plane could foresee what would happen in the next few minutes. The sudden eruption of panic, the alarms, the chaos that would turn every passenger's life upside down. But the girl, quiet, focused, and meticulous, sat in her seat, already preparing herself, unaware that soon she would become the only hope for hundreds of lives at 30,000 feet. The tranquility of Flight 480 just shattered in an instant. Alarms blared throughout the cabin, piercing the hum of the engines like a warning siren. Passengers froze mid-breath as the intercom crackled with the captain's tense voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost all engine power. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." Panic erupted instantly. Screams filled the cabin as oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, dangling like fragile lifelines. Children wailed, parents clutched them tightly, and travelers who had once argued over trivial annoyances now clung to seats, as if their lives depended on it. In the cockpit, the pilots' faces were etched with disbelief and fear. They toggled switches, flipped circuit breakers, and pushed buttons with desperate hope. But nothing responded. The plane, normally a marvel of engineering and precision, now seemed like a powerless bird plummeting through the sky. Instruments flashed warnings in red, each light a stark symbol of their vulnerability. Sweat poured from brows as they recalculated altitude, descent rate, and possible emergency landing sites. Every second stretched into eternity. Outside, the sky seemed to mock them with its calm blue serenity, a cruel contrast to the chaos inside. Amid the uproar, the quiet girl remained unnervingly calm. She gripped her book tightly, scanning the cabin with sharp, analytical eyes. She wasn't frozen in fear. She was calculating, observing patterns, and mentally rehearsing the steps she had learned over countless hours of study and simulation. Her eyes darted to the cockpit, noting the pilot's frantic gestures and the flashing warning lights. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that no one else could fix this on their own. The thought was frightening but also galvanizing. Flight attendants moved frantically down the aisles, struggling to reassure passengers who were hyperventilating or screaming. A mother tried to calm her sobbing daughter, whispering over and over that everything would be fine, though her own voice trembled. Business travelers, who moments ago had argued over seat assignments, now clutched armrests with white-knuckled intensity. Amid the chaos, every passenger became acutely aware of the fragility of life, and the realization brought a visceral fear that rippled like an electric current through the cabin. The girl slowly rose from her seat, weaving carefully through the panicked passengers. "Excuse me, I can help," she said, her voice calm and deliberate, cutting through the noise. Flight attendants turned, startled, unsure if she was in shock or just naive. "I know what to do in the cockpit," she continued, firm yet composed. Murmurs ran through the cabin. A teenage girl? Could she possibly help now, with hundreds of lives at stake? The pilots, hearing the commotion, hesitated but allowed her approach. She stepped into the cockpit, her presence unassuming but commanding in its quiet authority. The captain, eyes wide and hands shaking, looked at her skeptically. "I've studied emergency procedures. I can guide you through this," she said steadily. The cockpit crew, exhausted and terrified, had no choice but to listen. She pointed to specific instruments, calmly explaining the necessary maneuvers, calculating glide ratios and emergency protocols faster than anyone could. Every instruction she gave was precise, delivered with a clarity that cut through the panic. Back in the cabin, passengers gradually noticed a change. The girl's calm voice carried faintly through the cockpit intercom, a lifeline amidst the chaos. Some leaned forward in disbelief, hearing someone so young take control of a life-or-death situation. Flight attendants exchanged glances of cautious hope. Children stopped crying, sensing the change in tone, while adults clutched each other in tense anticipation. For the first time since the alarms went off, a sliver of hope threaded through the fear. The plane continued its rapid descent, but now it was guided, not blindly falling. The girl's presence had transformed the cockpit into a center of focused action amid the chaos, turning panic into calculated emergency response. Everyone on board had no idea that the quiet observer, the girl no one noticed before the flight, was about to become the only thing standing between them and disaster. The cockpit was tense, thick with fear and disbelief. The girl's calm presence seemed almost surreal against the backdrop of flashing warnings and alarm bells. The captain's hands hovered over the controls, uncertainty etched into every line of his face. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" he asked, voice trembling. She met his gaze steadily, unwavering. "I've studied emergency procedures and flight simulations extensively. I know exactly how to guide the plane. Please, trust me." Her words were measured, precise, carrying authority beyond her years. The captain hesitated, the weight of responsibility pressing on him, but nodded reluctantly. Once given the nod, she moved with surprising confidence, adjusting her seat to reach the controls efficiently. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, and unhesitant. She scanned the instrument's altitude, airspeed, vertical speed, and began issuing step-by-step instructions. Reduce the nose slightly, maintain a steady glide. Flaps at 30 degrees. Watch the descent rate carefully, she said, her voice calm and focused. The pilots followed, hands shaking but willing to obey. Each adjustment was critical. The plane had no power, and one wrong move could send them into disaster. Passengers had no idea what was happening in the cockpit. All they heard were snippets of calm instructions, barely audible over the roar of turbulence and screams. Yet there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Flight attendants noticed the girl's composure as she guided the pilots, and even the most panicked passengers felt a flicker of hope. Some clutched each other, eyes wide, silently praying. The invisible hand of calm in the cockpit was slowly spreading reassurance throughout the cabin. Outside, the ground approached at an alarming speed. The city skyline shrank rapidly, mountains and forests blurring past the windows. The plane was powerless, a fragile metal bird gliding toward the earth. Each second felt like an eternity, yet the girl remained focused, her mind calculating glide ratios, wind resistance, and possible landing paths. Every decision had to be perfect. There was no room for error, and she knew it. Sweat ran down her temple, but she ignored it, completely absorbed in saving the hundreds of lives aboard. The pilots, initially skeptical, began to trust her instincts. Lower the left wing slightly, hold altitude, she instructed, monitoring every gauge, every subtle movement. The plane responded obediently, almost miraculously, as though recognizing the precision of her calculations. One pilot muttered under his breath, "I don't know how she knows this, but it's working." Their fear remained, but it was tempered by growing confidence in her abilities. She had become the anchor in a sea of panic. Back in the cabin, a young boy peeked at the cockpit, eyes wide. Flight attendants subtly gestured for everyone to remain seated. A whisper spread, someone in the cockpit was taking control. Panic began to transform into curiosity, awe, and cautious hope. Families gripped each other, silently counting heartbeats. The girl, unnoticed by most just minutes ago, had become the unseen force holding everyone's fate in balance. Her calm voice and deliberate actions contrasted sharply with the chaos around her. Every maneuver was executed with precision. She adjusted flaps, monitored airspeed, and corrected descent angles, guiding the powerless plane like a master pilot. Outside, turbulence threatened to destabilize them, but she calculated the best response, instructing pilots on subtle corrections. Her knowledge, once theoretical, was now practical, vital, and heroic. The cockpit had become a controlled chaos of focus and determination, and all eyes, though few could see her, were unknowingly following her lead. As the plane continued its harrowing descent, the passengers remained unaware that survival was no longer a matter of luck. It rested entirely in the hands of the quiet girl, the one everyone had ignored at the start of the flight. At 30,000 feet, thousands of feet above the ground, she had become the unlikely hero, the center of a tense struggle between life and death. The impossible was happening. A powerless plane was being guided toward hope, and she was the calm at its core. The powerless plane sliced through turbulent air, each shudder sending passengers gripping seatbacks with white-knuckled intensity. Outside, clouds whipped past like ghostly curtains, sunlight flickering across the wings. Every instrument in the cockpit screamed warnings, altitude dropping too quickly, vertical speed alarming, airspeed fluctuating dangerously. Yet the girl's hands were steady, her eyes sharp, scanning every gauge and dial with the precision of someone who had spent countless hours imagining this exact moment. She issued calm, clear instructions to the pilots, who followed obediently. Though sweat streamed down their faces. Trim the rudder slightly to the left. Adjust flaps to maintain glide ratio, she commanded, her voice slicing through the chaos. The plane responded, obedient to her calculations. In the cabin, panic still raged, but subtle changes could be felt. Flight attendants whispered reassurances to passengers, who clutched their loved ones tighter, sensing somehow that someone in the cockpit had a plan. The boy in one for peered at the cockpit window, eyes wide, gripping his mother's hand. She whispered, "She's helping," unsure how she knew. Every second stretched into an eternity. The girl's mind raced, yet her voice never faltered. She calculated wind resistance, angle of descent, and how much control could be exerted on a powerless aircraft. The plane's nose dipped slightly as a gust from a high-altitude jet stream threatened to destabilize them. "Hold the yoke steady. Slight right correction," she instructed. The pilots adjusted, following her guidance with trembling hands. Slowly, the aircraft steadied, responding to her subtle corrections. It was delicate work. One error could send them plummeting, but she moved with an uncanny composure, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Passengers alternated between terror and awe. A businessman muttered prayers under his breath, a young girl clutched her doll tightly, and a mother hugged her child to her chest, whispering soothing words. Flight attendants peeked at the cockpit door, their eyes widening as they glimpsed the quiet girl, hands firm on the controls, issuing precise directions. No one could believe the calm authority she radiated. She had become the pulse of the plane, the force keeping disaster at bay. Turbulence intensified. The plane rocked violently, sending drinks spilling and luggage tumbling from overhead bins. Screams filled the cabin once more, but the girl's voice remained unwavering, steady, Keep the glide angle at 4.5 degrees. Monitor airspeed. Her instructions were met with obedience in the cockpit, a rhythm emerging amid the chaos. Each correction, each subtle shift, brought the plane closer to stability. Slowly, the uncontrolled descent began to resemble a glide rather than a free fall. In her mind, she visualized the runway, calculating distance, speed, and altitude. Every mile brought the impossible closer, landing the plane safely with no engine power. The pilots followed her guidance meticulously, trusting her expertise despite their disbelief. She directed minor adjustments, instructing when to raise flaps, when to bank slightly, and how to compensate for crosswinds. Each action required precision, each decision was critical, yet she moved with calm certainty. Outside, the city below seemed impossibly far, yet her focus never wavered. Every passenger's life depended on her calculations, and she knew it. The plane groaned under the strain of gravity and wind, but she refused to panic. She had trained her mind for this. Every simulation and every manual study culminating in this moment. With each command, the aircraft inched closer to controlled descent, defying the odds that had seemed insurmountable just minutes before. The turbulence raged, alarms blared, and panic threatened to return. But inside the cockpit, the girl was the calm eye of the storm. She was the improbable hero everyone had ignored, yet now the sole barrier between chaos and survival. At 30,000 feet, she guided the powerless plane, every instinct, every calculation, a lifeline in a sky that had turned suddenly deadly. The plane pitched violently as another gust of wind struck, rattling the fuselage like a fragile toy. Alarms blared, warning lights flashed red, and passengers screamed, gripping armrests and praying. The powerless aircraft seemed intent on defying the girl's careful calculations, but she refused to flinch. Her eyes narrowed, hands steady on the controls, mind racing through every emergency scenario she had studied. She knew one wrong move could spell disaster, yet she remained unnervingly composed. The cockpit had become a tense theater of focus, fear, and precision. Steady the nose, hold the glide at 4 degrees, she commanded, voice cutting through the chaos. The pilots, sweat dripping down their faces, obeyed her instructions, adjusting yoke and flaps with trembling hands. She monitored every gauge, the altimeter, vertical speed, and airspeed indicators, correcting tiny deviations with surgical precision. The plane responded, inch by inch, as though acknowledging her mastery over its powerless form. For the first time, the pilots began to trust her judgment, their fear giving way to reluctant confidence. Back in the cabin, chaos still reigned, but a subtle shift could be felt. Passengers felt the plane's sudden steadiness, and whispers began to replace cries. Flight attendants, eyes wide, glanced toward the cockpit, astonished at the calm authority guiding the pilots. Mothers held children closer, teenagers stopped screaming, and even the most terrified passengers sensed that someone completely unexpected was in control. The girl, once invisible, had become the unlikely anchor holding hundreds of lives together. The turbulence intensified further. The plane lurched, throwing drinks, papers, and loose items across the cabin. Screams erupted again, but inside the cockpit, she remained focused. Bank 2 degrees to the right. Correct for drift, she instructed crisply, adjusting for wind gusts that threatened to destabilize them. Every calculation had to be precise. A single misstep could be fatal. She felt the weight of responsibility, but it sharpened her mind rather than paralyzing it. Every decision was deliberate, every movement calculated, as though her entire life had been leading to this moment. The pilots, still tense but trusting, followed her commands with precision. The plane's glide began to smooth, a small but critical victory. Outside, clouds roared past, but the descent was no longer a freefall, it was a carefully guided approach. The girl's calm, confident demeanor radiated throughout the cockpit, slowly influencing the crew and indirectly the passengers. Hope began to take root amidst the fear. The impossible would become impossible, and she was the improbable hero at its center. Even as the plane steadied, doubt lingered. Could she really land a powerless plane hundreds of miles from the nearest emergency runway? Could she maintain focus long enough to prevent disaster? Her heart pounded, but she pushed fear aside. Logic, preparation, and instinct guided her every action. She monitored altitude, speed, and glide ratio, making subtle adjustments to compensate for wind and turbulence. Each correction brought them closer to a controlled descent, each success reinforcing her confidence. In the cabin, passengers began to notice the change. Whispers spread. Someone in the cockpit was in control. Some stared in disbelief, others murmured prayers of thanks. Flight attendants, previously frantic, exchanged glances of cautious hope. The quiet girl, who had been ignored moments ago, was now the linchpin of survival. Her courage and meticulous preparation were holding them all together. And for the first time since the alarms blared, it seemed possible that they might make it. As the powerless plane continued its perilous descent, the turbulence, alarms, and screaming became the background noise to her focused determination. She was battling not just the physical forces acting on the aircraft, but also the doubt that threatened to paralyze her or the crew. But with every precise instruction, every calculated adjustment, she proved that skill, courage, and focus could triumph over fear. At 30,000 feet, she had become the only thing standing between chaos and survival. The airport appeared through the haze of clouds like a distant lifeline. Runway lights flickered faintly, tiny beacons in the vast sky. Barely visible from 30,000 feet, the plane was still powerless, and every second counted. Passengers clutched armrests and whispered prayers. Flight attendants braced themselves, gripping the rails of overhead bins. The girl's calm voice pierced the chaos, issuing instructions to the pilots. Line up with the center line. Maintain glide angle. Flaps down gradually. Keep speed under control. Each word was deliberate, precise, and life-saving. The cockpit had transformed into a battlefield of focus and courage. The pilots, still tense but increasingly trusting, followed her every command. Their hands moved steadily, adjusting yoke and rudder as she instructed, compensating for the wind gusts and turbulence. Outside, clouds whipped past the windows, and the runway seemed impossibly far. She ignored fear, focusing solely on calculations, descent rate, angle, speed, distance to the runway. The powerless plane responded to her guidance, inching closer to hope. Every subtle adjustment was a lifeline. A miscalculation could send them skidding off the runway or worse. Passengers' panic shifted into tense anticipation. Some pressed foreheads to the windows, trying to spot the runway themselves. Children held toys and stuffed animals as if they might provide protection. A mother whispered reassurances to her sobbing child, though her own voice quivered. Flight attendants exchanged glances of disbelief as they observed the miraculous composure. Emerging from the cockpit, the girl, who moments ago had been overlooked and ignored, was now the center of every heartbeat on the plane. A sudden turbulence rocked the aircraft violently, throwing unsecured items across the cabin. Screams erupted, and the plane lurched toward the ground. Correct. Adjust flaps 20 degrees. Level the wings, she commanded, voice cutting through the alarms and screams. The pilots responded instantly, following her instructions with precision. The plane stabilized, the glide became smoother, and hope edged further into reality. Every second she held control was a battle won against gravity, fear, and chaos. The runway grew larger in the windshield, its lights brighter, guiding them like a fragile thread to safety. She calculated the final approach meticulously, speed, descent angle, wind compensation. The powerless plane began to line up perfectly with the runway. The pilots' hands were steady now, but their eyes betrayed awe. None of them could believe the confidence and skill emanating from a teenage girl who had been quietly overlooked for so long. Yet here she was, guiding them all toward survival. Prepare for touchdown. Keep speed steady. Don't let the nose dip, she instructed. The plane's wheels grazed the runway with a bone-jarring jolt. The cabin shook violently as it bounced, but she maintained control, guiding the powerless aircraft down the length of the asphalt. Screams turned to gasps of disbelief, then two cheers as the plane slowed safely. Passengers clutched loved ones, faces pale, but ecstatic. The unimaginable had happened. They were alive. The quiet girl had done the impossible. Emergency crews rushed toward the plane as it rolled to a stop. Doors opened and passengers erupted into tears, laughter, and stunned applause. The pilots, still shaken, turned toward the girl with gratitude and awe. She exhaled deeply for the first time in hours, allowing herself a faint, relieved smile. The cabin, once filled with terror, was now a sanctuary of astonishment and relief. The impossible had become reality, all because one quiet, overlooked girl refused to remain invisible when it mattered most. Outside, the media had begun arriving, capturing the miraculous scene. Everyone on board would remember this moment, the flight where panic reigned. Yet survival came from the most unexpected source. At 30,000 feet, a powerless plane had been guided to safety, and the hero was the one no one had noticed. The engines were still silent, but the chaos had ended. Emergency crews swarmed the plane, checking passengers and pilots for injuries. Miraculously, everyone was unharmed. The passengers, still trembling, slowly began to comprehend the miracle that had just occurred. Mothers hugged their children tighter, business travelers wiped sweat from their foreheads, and teenagers stared blankly, trying to process the impossible. All around, the quiet girl, the one no one had noticed, sat calmly in her seat, now a central figure in a story that would shock the nation. The pilots, hands still shaking, approached her. I don't know how to thank you," the captain stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "We couldn't have done it without you." Her eyes met his, calm and unassuming, yet filled with a quiet pride. "I just did what I had to," she replied softly. Behind her, passengers craned their necks, whispering to one another, realizing that their lives had been saved by someone they had dismissed, ignored, or overlooked, or rippled through the cabin. News crews had already begun capturing the scene, their cameras focusing on the girl whose composure had defied belief. Outside the plane, reporters scrambled, shouting questions, recording interviews, eager to capture the hero who had taken control of a powerless aircraft at 30,000 feet. Passengers shared their stories, tears flowing freely, recounting moments when they feared the worst. Flight attendants explained how she had navigated the pilots through turbulence and guided the plane to a safe landing. Her calm authority had turned chaos into hope. The airport staff and emergency personnel approached, offering congratulations and medals. Yet she remained humble. "It's not about me," she said quietly. "Everyone did their part. We all survived because we stayed calm and followed instructions." But for those who had been on the flight, it was undeniably her courage, preparation, and skill that had made the difference. The teenage girl who had been invisible moments ago had become the center of attention, the unlikely hero whose actions no one could forget. Social media erupted almost immediately. Videos of the landing, interviews with passengers, and eyewitness accounts spread like wildfire. The hashtag #HeroGirl soared across platforms as people marveled at her bravery and composure. Aviation experts weighed in, praising her calm precision and technical understanding. Pilots from around the country expressed astonishment that someone so young could remain composed under unimaginable pressure. The quiet girl, who had once gone unnoticed, now became a symbol of hope, courage, and skill. In the cabin, passengers slowly regained composure. Some embraced strangers, tears mingling with laughter. Children asked about the girl who saved the plane, while parents explained her heroism in hushed, reverent tones. Flight attendants shared quiet smiles, amazed at the improbable turn of events. Every person on board carried a profound sense of gratitude, a mix of disbelief and awe, realizing how easily their lives could have ended moments earlier. The pilots, too, remained in stunned silence, replaying every command she had given, every correction she had made. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a calm, precise, and courageous presence guiding a powerless plane to safety. They realized that bravery isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it is quiet, calculated, and unassuming. The girl had rewritten the narrative of heroism in a single flight, proving that courage and skill could come from the most unexpected place. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting golden light over the tarmac, the passengers, crew, and emergency personnel slowly processed the enormity of what had happened. The quiet girl, once overlooked and underestimated, had become the center of a story that would inspire a nation. She had faced unimaginable odds, conquered doubt, and emerged as the improbable hero whose calm under pressure had saved countless lives. At 30,000 feet in the days that followed, the quiet girl became a national sensation. News outlets from across the country covered her story, replaying footage of the powerless plane's descent and miraculous landing. Interviews captured her calm, thoughtful demeanor, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted on Flight 482. She answered questions with humility, always emphasizing teamwork and preparation. Yet it was impossible to overlook that her courage and knowledge had saved hundreds of lives. Across living rooms and social media feeds, people were captivated not just by her heroism, but by the quiet determination that had carried her through the crisis. Schools, aviation programs, and youth organizations began inviting her to speak. She inspired thousands of young people, especially girls, who realized that courage and intelligence could come from the quietest individuals. Flight simulators, manuals, and practice sessions she had once studied obsessively were now teaching tools for a new generation, proving that preparation and focus could make a life or death difference. Experts praised her poise and technical understanding, describing her actions as the epitome of rational heroism under extreme pressure. She had transformed the narrative of bravery, proof that heroism could come in silence and subtlety. For the passengers, the memory of Flight 482 remained vivid. Mothers whispered to children, recalling the teenage girl who had calmly guided the pilots. Business travelers and teenagers told colleagues and friends how they had watched someone they initially ignored take control, saving every single life on board. Flight attendants, still shaken, shared stories of her precise guidance and composure. The girl had become a symbol of hope, courage, and possibility, an ordinary person rising to extraordinary circumstances. Her story reminded everyone that heroes do not always appear in uniforms or with accolades. Sometimes they are the quietest, most observant among us. The airline, impressed and grateful, established a scholarship in her name to support young students pursuing aviation careers. They highlighted her story as an example of preparation, courage, and calm decision-making under pressure. Pilots, both experienced and aspiring, studied the incident to understand her methods, realizing that her ability to remain composed and precise had been as critical as any training or engine on the plane. She had proven that mental preparation could sometimes outweigh experience. Intuition could rival expertise, and courage could be quiet yet undeniable. Years later, she reflected on the flight with characteristic humility. She recalled the terror, the alarms, and the sense of responsibility. Yet she also remembered the calm focus that had allowed her to act decisively. The memory of those moments remained vivid not as trauma, but as a testament to the human capacity for courage and intelligence under pressure. She continued to study, learn, and inspire others, always emphasizing that anyone could make a difference if they prepared, observed, and stayed calm when it mattered most. Her heroism continued to ripple beyond the initial story. Students inspired by her visited flight schools. Women pursued careers in aviation with newfound confidence, and ordinary people carried a renewed belief in the potential for quiet courage in their own lives. Every lecture, every media appearance, every discussion about Flight 482 reinforced the idea that heroism is not always loud, celebrated, or immediate. It can be subtle, careful, and profoundly transformative. The quiet girl, once invisible to the world around her, became a beacon of hope and courage. At 30,000 feet, in a powerless plane teetering on the edge of disaster, she had proven that preparation, composure, and intelligence could save lives. She had turned fear into action, chaos into order, and doubt into certainty. Her story became a lasting reminder. Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the one who will rise to the occasion, change the course of events, and leave the world forever in awe of their courage. And as she looked back, years later, she simply smiled, knowing she had done what needed to be done quietly, carefully, heroically.